Disclaimer. My work draws heavily upon the works of Carlos Castaneda. While there are few direct quotes, the underlying concepts are drawn from his work. My interpretations of those works are provided to advance my own point of view and in no way constitute a claim to anything that was not created by me. I have no commercial interest in this work. It is provided free for those who might find value in it. I have no connection with Castaneda's estate, nor with any entity, commercial or otherwise, that claims to be connected with Castaneda or with anyone connected to him. I express no opinion on the claims of those who purport to be connected with Castaneda, in the present or in the past.
Lastly, this work should not be construed as in any way condoning, supporting, encouraging, or recommending the use of any dangerous or illegal substance, or the performing of any dangerous or illegal activities. The teaching and research methods depicted in Castaneda's works should be viewed as the result of a unique convergence of time, place, and circumstance, and not as a template that any other person should attempt to follow.
Chapter 6, Part 3. 2.2. Acting without expecting rewards. This aspect of replacing self-pity was so subtle that it was never even mentioned as a lesson, until almost the very end of Castaneda's and Don Juan's association. Don Juan would at various times ask Castaneda to perform certain apparently pointless tasks. He would ask Castaneda to lay a line of sticks, end to end, around the perimeter of the house. To wear his hat a certain way, for 5 days, then go wearing it the old way. To dig a hole, then, sometime later, fill it back in. And so on. Castaneda did these things, out of respect at first, and over time just more or less expected them and simply did them. Don Juan never mentioned these tasks other than to assign them, and the two never discussed them until near the very end when the lesson was revealed. The explanation, when it came, was rather simple, but its role in helping to erase self-pity was clear. Don Juan explained that over time humans develop a mercantile mentality. That is, life becomes a series of transactions. And intrinsic to that view is the examination of every transaction to determine who got the better end of any given situation. We will often evaluate a friendship, for instance, as follows. I did X for her, and got nothing in return, or, when Y happened, I was there for him, when Z happened to me, he wasn't there for me. And so on. And far from thinking there is anything wrong with this way of measuring things, most of us actively and enthusiastically endorse it as a way of evaluating friendships, relationships, family situations, etc. That this happens seems natural. Certainly, we all have needs and expectations, and as human beings we are more or less forced to consider the state of those needs and expectations, more or less continuously. But it only seems natural because the pattern has been learned early on and is continually reinforced, from within us and from the outside. Much of the task of learning sorcery involves undoing these entrenched habits. The transactional way of looking at life is a prime example. This way of processing life situations inevitably leads, over years and years, to a large pile of losses, that is, transactions where we perceive to have come out behind, often not by fair or logical means, in our way of thinking. This is a petri dish for self-pity to grow and thrive in. Whenever we need to, we can think back to the most recent or the most devastating defeat. They are always close at hand. Self-pity is strengthened by this process, and our self-importance is buttressed. We didn't deserve to lose. We'll be particularly vigilant going forward, so that so-and-so never gets the better of us again. What the Nawal does is to break down this damaging mentality by creating constant small opportunities for the student to act for its own sake, with no expectation of personal gain or other reward. The student will take these tasks as a joke, at worst harmless. Over time, the mercantile mentality is supplanted by the opposite, a freeing feeling of having the freedom to act, unencumbered by the bookkeeping that had become automatic in our lives. If the teacher is successful, the student in most cases will not even be aware of what is happening, as was the case with Castaneda. Don Juan never mentioned it until the day before their very last earthly contact. And so complete and masterful was Don Juan's delivery of the lesson that Castaneda never had any inkling that from the beginning the string of apparently meaningless tasks was part of a carefully designed program to alter Castaneda's way of handling life situations.
2.3. The place of no pity. Both the ancient seers and the modern sorcerers examined the luminous body in exhaustive detail. They noticed that while every person's assemblage point was on a different unique spot, there were identifiable spots on the right side that always produced identical behavior when the assemblage point moved to those spots. To the ancient seers, who, according to Don Juan, were obsessive about classifications and organization, this was a satisfying find, and they devised ways to make a person's assemblage point move to these various spots. Unlike the Nawal's blow that sends the point randomly into the left side, these right side movements of the assemblage point were carefully calibrated to produce only the intended result every time. One such special spot with importance for sorcery was called the place of no pity. The Nawal must take his apprentice to this spot. By doing so he helps crush self-pity and just as importantly develops in the new Nawal a certain ruthlessness, not to the point of evil but to enable him to deal with what is to come on his journey. The story of how Don Juan did this with Castaneda is alternately hilarious and truly scary. The two men were in a medium-sized border city in Mexico. They stopped into a luncheonette to have a bite to eat, and, as was his custom, Don Juan engaged strangers in conversation. This inevitably made Castaneda uncomfortable, thus putting him on edge and forcing his tonal to shrink back a little. In this particular case, Don Juan struck up a conversation with two old women. He explained that Castaneda was his nephew, and that he was taking the boy to the US to help find him a wife. Don Juan and the women talked at length about the various pluses and minuses of marrying a Mexican girl as opposed to an American girl, etc., as Castaneda silently wished the floor would swallow him up, so deep was his embarrassment. At a certain point, Don Juan said, "I'm taking him to the place of no pity," and laughed, as did the women. Castaneda would have laughed too had he not been quite so mortified, considering that he was referring to either the United States or the state of matrimony as the place of no pity, or both. What Don Juan was in fact doing, aside from setting Castaneda up for the blow to come by putting him off guard with embarrassment, was doing what a responsible Nawal does: he says exactly what he is going to do. Thus, he announced that he was taking Castaneda to the place of no pity. That Castaneda couldn't have known what Don Juan was referring to makes Don Juan's confession no less accurate or correct. The meal was done and they headed out into the shopping district. Castaneda had several stops to make. He had planned to give presents to a number of people in the US upon his return to Los Angeles.
They visited several stores. It took some time, but finally they were ready to depart the city. Castaneda took the packages and put them in the trunk of his car and was getting ready to go when he noticed that Don Juan was having difficulty getting around to the side of the car. Alarmed, he went to help. Don Juan could barely speak intelligibly. Castaneda considered that the older man might have suffered a stroke. He opened the passenger side door and tried to help Don Juan get into the car so that he could get him to a hospital. Suddenly Don Juan started screaming at Castaneda, saying that Castaneda was trying to kidnap him. His histrionics soon caught the attention of onlookers. Castaneda started to become quite nervous. He explained that his friend had most likely had a stroke and that he was trying to help him. But Don Juan's screaming drowned him out. He exclaimed that Castaneda was going to kidnap him and take him to the US, to be sold to a lab and used for medical experiments. The crowd grew more menacing. A number of young men looked at Castaneda with venomous intent. The police had been called and Castaneda could hear a distant siren getting closer. He tried to reason with Don Juan one last time, but the old man's ranting became louder and crazier. This did nothing to quiet the swelling mob. Castaneda saw the likely outcome: a severe beating at the hands of the young men in the crowd, and being thrown in jail and charged with kidnapping and Lord knows what else. He suddenly bolted through the crowd and found a temporary hiding place. This was no solution. He would be found at any moment by the mob or by the police, who had now arrived. He considered his situation and struggled to breathe, gripped by confusion, fear, and panic. Then something in him snapped. He calmly stood up, walked back to the car, opened the trunk, took out the presents he had bought, and distributed them to people in the crowd. Oblivious to his fate, Don Juan suddenly reverted to his familiar manner. Castaneda, in a semi-daze, it felt like, vaguely heard Don Juan apologizing to the police for the misunderstanding, thanking the crowd for coming to his aid, and assuring everyone that everything was absolutely fine. They got in the car and drove off, not speaking for a long time. When they did speak again, Don Juan explained what he had done, and that his mention of the place of no pity in the restaurant had been literal. He went on to explain that at the moment when the apprentice Nagual has had enough, his mask is revealed. Every leader, Don Juan said, has a mask, an emotion or state of being that conceals his true thoughts and nature. A Nagual, by and large, doesn't openly display his true feelings to others in stressful situations, so each Nagual develops his mask at the moment the place of no pity is reached. The mask might be laughter, or intellectual curiosity, or sadness, or any number of other things. Castaneda's mask was generosity. At the moment when everything snapped and he reached the place of no pity, he walked to the car and gave away all his purchases. While Don Juan told Castaneda that he thought fake generosity was a crummy mask, it wasn't said maliciously. The mask arises spontaneously at a time of fantastic stress. It is not chosen consciously.